Hey, it's Lugsch-Tehle, existential lifestyle coach. I wanted to share a new tool that helped me go from getting out behind my coping mechanisms of blame, denial, and avoidance to sharing my core emotion. And that really has left me feeling with more stress-free serenity. So check it out. I get pretty wore out, as I imagine that you do too, as we have to start over what feels like again and again with a particular loved one. This happens to me because I hate watching other people struggle. It's tough for me anyway. And those natural consequences, those things that happen to us as humans when we choose a particular path, typically lead to a rough and tough patch, a feeling of overwhelm, suffering, etc. And those are not so healthy choices, right? So those big feelings get bigger, and this in my case can be with my kids or with a loved one who's experiencing a particular addiction. You see, I don't want to have to deal with those rough and tough big feelings. I don't want to have to deal with it. So I try to remove any obstacle that tends to lead to undesirable natural consequences. So I put on this overly snug God suit that no longer fits, and I tend to convince myself that I'm more in control of other people than I really am. And the smell that you might be thinking right now is that stinking thinking that goes along with such terrible logic. And when I get a whiff of that, I immediately need to take a step back and admit my powerlessness over someone else's behavior. And I just really need to recognize that if I don't relinquish what I call the illusion of control, that I will then continue to experience greater and greater levels of unmanageability. And I know what that feels like. So in short, I need to learn to turn my will over to the care of a power greater than myself. This is classic step one work if you're familiar with recovery rooms. Instead, what I often do is confront serious levels of increasing suffering. And why? I mean, I know the theory, right? Here I am telling it to you. Here's why. The equation looks a little something like this. Suffering, S, equals P, pain times resistance. We know that pain is inevitable, right? I'm never going to be freed from or exonerated from pain, uncertainty, hard work. Yet this resistance to that pain, it increases. So what increases then? My suffering. And for me, resistance takes various forms, mainly three forms that I've learned from Dr. Stephen Stonsny. He calls these coping mechanisms. He says that in our toddler brain, when we were quite young, we learned what were considered to be three vital mechanisms or coping mechanisms to survive: blame, deny, avoid. So, get this, to convince myself that I have more control than I really do, I tend to look for ways to control people and or situations. And I do this, I control them by blaming them or by blaming someone in their life or something else or a circumstance. Another way to think about it is I'm judging myself, I'm judging another person, or I'm judging the circumstance. Or I deny that it ever happened. Nothing ever happened to begin with. Or I avoid it altogether. It's the toddler brain tricking myself into thinking that I have it all figured out. Again, that overly tight God suit, that I'm in control, that if this other person or this situation or this circumstance would just change already, that all would be peachy. All the while, I have buried my core emotion in a Fort Knox level Army installation. Which is to say, I have buried my core emotion of sadness, maybe it's pain, maybe it's fear of failure, fear of loss, deep, deep in my heart. So enter the tool mirroring my emotions. Check it out. It's the name I gave it, but credit again goes to Dr. Stonsny. Here's how it goes. Step one, think of a time that you were resentful. Then step two, ask yourself, what might I also feel guilty about? What might I also feel ashamed of? What might I also be afraid of? And then step three, what's the core emotion behind that feeling? And finally, step four, we have to remember core emotions are actually self-correcting. So for example, fear is actually telling yourself, I need to feel safe. And so that motivation is a good thing, right? Guilt is telling you that perhaps you violated a moral value. So you need to be true to your values, make amends, and if you follow that particular motivation, everything's good. Shame might be telling you, so for example, if it's about failure, to try a little bit harder, be more perseverant, and be successful. It's not a punishment, again, it's a motivation to find success, be that better version of yourself. And just like that, you can go from hiding behind those coping mechanisms, like for me, blame, denial, and avoidance, for example, to sharing your core emotions. And I promise you, when you do that, when you share that core emotion with a trusted friend, you will experience what I like to call stress-free serenity. So here's the bonus tip. Notice how I said trusted friend. Be sure to find a community of people, a confidant, a sponsor, someone trustworthy to share your core emotion with. Because sharing your core emotion, say for example with a loved one who's experiencing addiction, that's like going to a hardware store for a loaf of bread. So knowing where to get your needs met and then knowing when the shelves are empty are two important added bonus tips to this. So this has dramatically changed my life. It's changed the way that I interact with my loved ones. It's brought balance back to my life, emotionally speaking, and it's brought back a certain quality of life that I was sorely missing. So thanks for listening, and here is to living unstoppably free today.